Jesus stood up in the temple to read. We are told that the eyes of all the people were looking intently at him. Every reader in church knows what it is like to have the eyes of everyone in the church staring right at you. The priest in the pulpit knows all too well the terrifying feeling of all those terrifying people staring at him. The teacher in the school certainly knows that feeling too. Jesus saw all those eyes upon him. But what was it that Jesus saw in those eyes looking upon him? Jesus looked into all those eyes and saw poor people in need of good news. He saw captive people in need of liberty, oppressed people in need of consolation. He saw blind people, people who did not see the truth and were longing to see. Jesus saw all this in the eyes of those looking upon him. So he chose to read the words of the prophet Isaiah. I have been anointed to bring good news to these poor, to proclaim liberty to these captives, to give sight to these blind eyes, and to let these oppressed go free. What is it that we see in the eyes looking at us? Do you ever look back into those faces? What do you see there? Once, while visiting the beautiful country of Cambodia, I went into the dreaded Tuol Sleng building. This had once been a school, but during the 1970s, when the terrible regime of the Khmer Rouge was devastating the country, and in a period of 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, managed to slaughter 1/3 of the population of that country, this former school building was used as a notorious prison for interrogation, torture, and execution. During that time, 20,000 prisoners were hauled into this building, and of those 20,000, 12 people survived. I actually spoke with 2 of these. The suffering that you feel in the walls there to this day is something I will never forget. It is now a museum of genocide. When you walk into the building, you see the pictures of the prisoners there. Each one was photographed when hauled into the prison to their interrogation, their torture, and their death. You see thousands of these pictures, thousands of these faces, those eyes staring at you. It is a very difficult thing to look at. I spent the entire day in that museum, and I made it a point to look into the eyes of every one of those people looking at me from these mugshots. I felt I owed that to those people there. Those faces, those eyes continue to haunt me, and I am sure they will haunt me through the rest of my days. Each one of those faces, each one of those expressions was different. Some of them were the faces of very old women and very old men. Some were the faces of young mothers holding babies, but the vast majority were the faces of very young teenagers awaiting their fate. Some of them looked at me with a startled, puzzled, confused expression, not knowing what was going on. Others still had a sweet smile on their faces, totally unaware of the horrible fate in store for them. Others looked at me as they looked so many decades ago at the photographer, with a pleading look, a look of, "Please help me." Still others looked out with an accusing look. "How could you do this to me? How could you not help me?" Some of them look upon you with faces that are already swollen and bloody, while some stare at you with an expression of utter despair. Those eyes were all intently looking upon me, and I saw all of this in those faces, in those eyes. The eyes of all are upon us, every one of us. The eyes of the world are looking intently at us. What do we see in those eyes? Do we see the eyes of brothers and sisters in need of our helping hand? Do we see the blind eyes of brothers and sisters not seeing the truth all around them and so seeking enlightenment? Do we see the eyes of brothers and sisters oppressed, marginalized, brutalized? Do we see the eyes of brothers and sisters pleading for our help? Do we see the eyes of brothers and sisters who are captive and waiting to be set free by us? The eyes of all are upon us. What do we see in those eyes? The great American poet Walt Whitman once wrote, "In the faces of men and women I see God, and in my own face in the glass I find letters from God dropped in the street, and every one is signed by God's name." Let us see the face of God in the eyes of those looking into ours. Let us find those letters, those invitations from God dropped into our laps. Every tear is an invitation for us to reach out and dry that tear. Every pleading look from the eyes upon us, an invitation for us to do something to stop the oppression, to set the captives free, to give sight to the blind. The eyes of all are upon us. What do we see? Whom do we see in those eyes?